Okay, so this is the slide that we left off on last night in the live session where we talked about the second and third types of fungi, keeping in mind that we said that there were 4 types of fungi, and we pulled out lichens because they are a fungus, but they also have that other organism that is living with them in a symbiotic relationship that has chlorophyll in it. Here are some pictures of some lichen. Lichen morphology is what they call it. So it's how the lichen grows in different kinds. So we have a mixture of crostose lichen at the top. Notice the different colors. We have another kind here on the lower left. It looks a little bit like there's flowers on those rocks. And then we have the third kind in the lower right, which is what we typically see on trees that grows out and around the bark of a tree, especially or rocks in the forest, where it's a little bit darker, but there is still some light available. If we continue on, we have our 4th type of fungi, which again is called the imperfect fungi. And yes, there is some overlap between the different kinds that we've been talking about. The imperfect are the zygote or mold. They include the zygote, mold, sac, and club fungi that can only reproduce asexually. Some of these other fungi can reproduce sexually, but these ones that we're talking about here that are imperfect can only reproduce asexually, which means, of course, that there comes a time when they will die, because keep in mind that reproducing asexually means that as you reproduce, you split yourself in half and you get smaller and smaller. So that's why they're called imperfect, because if this occurs, then eventually they're going to have size problems. These are the types of fungi that cause most of the fungal diseases in humans. So these are the fungi that we don't want to get. For example, ringworm, athlete's foot, and thrush. Thrush is a fungus that is typically found in toddlers once they have started to go to places where there are other kids. And the reason that they get thrush is because they put their hands in their mouth all the time. So thrush is a fungus that infects the mouth. And it looks like your mouth gets full of red, yucky sores. Athlete's foot is the one that I was talking about in class yesterday, where if you go walking around in a locker room or a pool area or places like that, where it's often very damp and wet a lot of times, you could get athlete's foot. Now, not everyone is susceptible to these fungi, but a lot of people are. Ringworm is another one. Again, it's a fungus. It looks like it's a worm has emerged from underneath your skin, but it too is a fungus and therefore can be treated with antifungal medication. Excuse me. So here are some pictures of the different kinds. So ringworm is here on the left. Notice the ring type shape of it. Athlete's foot, this is a severe case of athlete's foot. A lot of times it will be caught very quickly when it's just between the toes because it becomes very itchy. And then thrush, notice that the baby's mouth is full of white gunk and the tongue is all bumpy. Again, that's the fungus growing, and that's the fungal infection that we have. We have medication that will treat all of these, but we still just don't want to get them to begin with. So let's talk about fungi reproduction at this point. The structure of the fungi that you can see is the part that carries out the reproduction. Most fungi reproduce by using spores. Remember, spores aren't seeds, but they are similar to seeds in that they're a little pack of reproductive parts that will spoosh out into the air so that they can spread rather quickly. They also can get stuck on other animals. Fungi spores are microscopic, so we can't see them most of the time when they are released. For example, the mushrooms and puffballs, when these are released, they release huge clouds of spores. If you check out on the web, there are videos of puffball releases, and those are just incredible. When you think about those all being tiny little spores of fungi, it sort of makes you go, ugh. But each cloud contains millions of spores. So if we think about this in terms of what we know about natural selection, why do you think that fungi would have to have millions of spores in order to survive? Think about that for a minute and come up with a good answer as to why fungi have to have millions of spores when they reproduce. So reproduction is classified according to the ways that the different fungi form spores and the shape of the structure in which the spores are made. So we don't typically think about classifying reproduction. We just say that it's asexual or sexual reproduction. But because fungi have unique methods of reproduction, these two things allow us to classify the fungi a little bit more carefully than we normally would for other organisms. So if we look at the fungi reproduction of the 4 types of fungi, the zygote and mold fungi reproduce asexually and sexually. So most of the time they will reproduce asexually, where they'll have one cell and then it will split and it will become 2 smaller cells. However, that's only going to work for a certain amount of time, and then they're going to have to reproduce sexually so that 2 smaller cells of mold or fungi can get together and form a larger piece of fungi or a larger organism of fungi so it can continue to grow. There is some mold that is reproducing. Sac fungi reproduce again sexually and asexually, depending on the situation. Here's a good example and a good picture of what that looks like. So these sac fungi on the left, you can see what they look like in real life, and they look almost like a bowl. And then on the right, we have the picture. So a few words here that you don't know yet, but if we take a look at what's going on, they've sort of cut away the outside of the fungi here, so we could take a look at it. And this fungi is interesting because it has both the male organ and the female organ in one plant. So they can reproduce sexually without having to cut themselves in half, or they can reproduce asexually by having spores. Okay, so when they are reproducing asexually, then what they do is they have this zygote here, which would be a spore, and these are tiny little spores on the inside. And eventually this zygote with a 2N, we'll get into that another time, but this zygote here in the hyphae is going to eventually get to the point where it's going to burst out. And when it bursts out, this fungi will get a little bit smaller. However, we also have the male and female organs here, and when that occurs, then you have what we end up with calling a positive mating type and a negative mating type spore. And these spores then have to find each other in order to sexually reproduce and create another cup fungus. So it's not like what we would normally think of as sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction, because this can do both, because it has both male and female parts, and it has the ability to make spores that are identical to the fungi itself. So again, remember that as I'm going through this, you can pause the video at any time to get the information you need to answer the questions. Club fungi reproduce again, both sexually and asexually. If we take a look at this, we have the puffballs and on the left, and another giant type of mushroom on the right. Look how big it is compared to those leaves. And the puffballs on the left, typically, if you squeeze them, they send out a poof of powdery spores. The imperfect fungi can only reproduce asexually, which is really why they're called imperfect, because then that causes their demise eventually. So how do fungi get around not being so tall and not being tall enough really like a tree that they're typically found near in order to get the sunlight that they may need or in order to defend themselves against other organisms? Well, this causes them a major problem. Many fungi do not grow tall enough to clear the boundary layer of still air next to the ground. So what that means, this boundary layer, is if we look at the ground and we're talking about air currents, then we have the ground here. Oops. This is the ground. The mushrooms, the fungi, you know, if it's a big mushroom, it'll sit like this, but a lot of them just lay flat on the surface. And they're not very tall at all. In fact, we step on them all the time, like I was saying, on rocks. And the amount of air here in this area doesn't really go anywhere. It just sort of sits there. The winds and the breezes occur higher up, nowhere near where the mushrooms are. So if they want to reproduce and they want to spread out and they're using spores, then they have a problem because there's only still air around them and their spores aren't going to be able to get anywhere. So they have developed a mechanism. They have evolved to have a mechanism that allows them to shoot their spores into the wind. Okay, which is why when we think about a puffball and you think about it exploding out, that's why they do it. There's a lot of pressure inside so that it can burst out and shoot the spores upwards or out. They also use animals, water, or wind for dispersal. So their spores will stick to animals. They can float in the water to get other places. And obviously they use the wind when they shoot their spores out. Once spores are caught by something, they can be carried very long distances because they're so teeny tiny. In fact, many of them are microscopic, so you don't even know, the organism doesn't even know that it's carrying the spores from these fungi. And this is sometimes how you get mushrooms in your yard if you've never had them before. It's because an animal, more than likely, an animal or the wind carried some fungi spores into your yard, dropped them off when they laid down or when the wind stopped, and then over time they found a good food source there. The spores activated and they started to grow. And then pretty soon you have mushrooms appearing in your yard where you didn't have them before. So let's take a look at some spore dispersals. Number one, it could be like this. They could actually have pressure coming out of the bottom here, which shoots them out when they open, when the top opens. We also have people. They get stuck on people's hands and we carry them around. Or you push in on one, an organism steps on a spore, on a puffball mushroom, and notice the holes on the top and the black gunk that comes out. Those are all spores. Or of course we have our flies that sit down on the fungus and they then get the spores stuck to them and they carry them off. So 4 different types of spore dispersal. If you think about the person having touched the spores and carried them off, the fungi itself shooting it, the animals carrying it off either by landing on it or stepping on it. The fungi can also reproduce from pieces of hyphae, so they don't even need their whole fruit to be around in order to reproduce. What can happen is hyphae can be broken off and wind and water can carry pieces of it to other places, and then the hyphae can continue to survive. Because remember, the hyphae was a little spore that had a stem, if you want to call that, coming out, and then that branched, and it branched, and it branched, and it continued. So if this little piece got broken off from a larger mycelium, this can certainly survive all on its own, and it can be carried elsewhere in a rainstorm or in the woods, in the wind, and then whenever it lands, it will just continue to grow. And if enough moisture and food is present, the spore or hyphae can grow into new fungi. And that actually happens quite a bit in a lot of the United States because there is enough moisture and food present. In some places you don't get this very much. So like where I live in Nevada, we don't get very much fungi here because it's so dry. We're in a high desert climate. So every once in a while you'll see some come up, but most of the time we don't get them. Whereas I know the people that are in Washington or are in New England or in Florida region, you get a lot more because there's a lot more moisture. So that is it for the rest of the notes for the fungi questions. Good luck, and hopefully you'll get all of this information down so that you'll have it for later. Bye.